if the agricultural food system emissions just carried on business as usual, those food system emissions alone would actually take us past our 1.5 degree climate target and get us quite a substantial way towards 2 degrees.
If cultivated meat is made using renewable energy, it would lead to a 92% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when compared with beef, a 52% reduction when compared with pork, and a 17% when compared with chicken.
It's not as easy as saying we have an innovative product and then the innovative product is solving all the problems that we have. Because food and eating are culturally so strong, the social component of eating is underestimated.
Our current food systems are inherently unsustainable and ill-equipped to face the challenges posed by climate change. And it's no secret that meat and dairy are particularly problematic in this regard because they are very carbon-intensive to produce. And unfortunately, some scientists predict that demand for meat and dairy could grow by up to 70% by the year 2050. Now, some experts say lab-grown or cultivated meat and dairy could get us out of this pickle. But is that really the case? And what would have to change for us to embrace such products? So for this episode, we'll be taking a closer look at cultivated meat. My name is Neil King, and you're listening to On the Green Fence. But before we get started on lab-grown meat alternatives, let's just get a handle on how big the problem is right now that we're facing when it comes to conventional meat and dairy production.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Lynch. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford, now based in the Department of Zoology, and I'm interested in sustainable land use and the impact of agricultural production.
Mm-hmm. John, your research, I understand it also focuses on the climate change effects of meat and dairy production in particular, right?
That's right, yeah.
Could you give our listeners an idea, just how detrimental meat and dairy are for this planet?
Yeah, so there's all different ways of generating these numbers that will tell you slightly different things. When it comes down to it, if we run our climate models with and without these emissions from meat and dairy, we'd be looking at something like the order of magnitude a quarter to maybe a third of overall warming attributable to meat and dairy production. So they're a significant contributor to global warming, meat and dairy production. I was involved in a study a couple of years ago with Mike Clark, my colleague here was the lead author. And we basically ran a simple climate approach. And we said, well, even if we decarbonized energy production immediately, if the agricultural food system emissions just carried on business as usual, what would happen? And those food system emissions alone would actually take us past our 1.5 degree climate target and get us quite a substantial way towards 2 degrees. And this is obviously extremely optimistic because we haven't and we're not going to switch off fossil fuels that quickly. And that is partly because there's growing human population and partly because the world is kind of getting richer and eating on average a greater proportion of livestock-based foods. So it's exactly these trends that you highlight there that make it such an important issue.
John, I found this study in Science. It's from 2018. It calculated that meat, aquaculture, eggs and dairy use about 83% of the world's farmland, while providing only 37% of humanity's protein consumption and 18% of our calories. So, just looking at those figures, it strikes me that livestock is rather inefficient in terms of our food supply.
So that's ultimately what it comes down to, really, the sustainability question of where and if livestock production fits into a sustainable food system. It's essentially that you have to grow the plants, which might be feed crops or it might simply be grass. So you're using the area, the agricultural inputs, kind of your fertilizer resources and things to produce plants. And then if you put that through an animal before it gets converted into a human edible product, then you've essentially lost some of that. So it is really just a question of efficiency, and it's lost through the animal just going through its normal biology. And it's not to say that it's inherently kind of unsustainable. I think personally, I believe there will be some smaller role for livestock in a sustainable food system. But if we're just growing a huge amount of crops and then kind of inefficiently processing them through animals, we do arrive at some of these figures like that you're talking about, which essentially points to them being the inefficiency in the system.
Okay, so time to take a closer look at lab-grown meat, which some also call cultivated meat or cultured meat or even cell-based meat. They all mean the same thing. But just how is it made? Basically, you take some animal cells and place them in a nutrient-filled broth so they duplicate lots of times. Then you change that broth just a little bit and put them in a bioreactor, which ends up giving you a meat cell mush that can be turned into patties or sausages or, you name it. So theoretically, you could feed the entire planet with cells taken from a single cow, as long as you get the mixture and scale right. No animal has to die for this, and you avoid the downsides of factory farming, such as animal cruelty, the extensive use of antibiotics, which in turn is, fueling antibiotic resistances. There are no dangerous bacteria or contaminants that you'll often find in factory farming, etc. However, critics say that the cultivated meat show is essentially run by the same agribusinesses that are literally making a killing with conventional meat products, and that it could reinforce the meat system as a whole by providing new opportunities for companies to expand their existing factory farming operations. However, having said that, the same accusation could be levelled at plant-based alternatives. Here in Germany, for instance, a meat giant called Wiesenhof has adopted a very successful range of plant-based meat products. But given how expensive it still is to produce cultivated meat, it is very questionable whether such products can ever be scaled up without the investment of big business. So just to give you an idea, the first cultivated meat hamburger in 2012 cost around $325,000 to produce. So time to bring in somebody now who's convinced that price tag is going to drop rapidly to affordable levels as this technology advances, and that cultivated meat will be a game changer, especially when it comes to the environment.
Hi, my name is Seren Kell, and I'm the Science and Technology Manager at the Good Food Institute Europe.
The Good Food Institute is a non-profit organisation that promotes both cultivated meat and plant-based meat, and they are hoping that the market for alternative meat and dairy products will expand dramatically to $1.4 trillion by 2050. But what is the current status quo?
Cultivated meat as an industry is still very much in its infancy. So a lot of the most exciting developments, I would say, are around people trying to develop what we call whole cuts. So these are products which are really designed to authentically recreate the texture of steak or chicken breast. So using innovations like 3D printing, for example. And just a specific example on that front. So Meat Tech 3D in Israel, they recently announced that they've actually produced a 4-ounce cultivated steak using 3D printing. So that was really, really cool. But in reality, I think a lot of the first products that are going to be commercialized are likely to be things like burgers and sausages and nuggets, which are less complicated products and just easier to bring to market.
Mm-hmm. But just that one example you mentioned there, that means in theory, I could, if I had a 3D printer, just print my own steak and throw it on the barbecue?
I wish it was so easy. So because you are working with real animal cells, it's not as simple as just printing out a plastic cutout from a template mold. Cells have various different requirements for growing and also to make sure that they are the right cell types, so things like muscle and fat, and that they have access to the right nutrients, which is what we call the cell culture media. And to get all of these things right and to get them to actually replicate the real kind of 3D tissue structure of what meat tissue is really like, there's a lot of really complicated tissue engineering, cell biology, chemical engineering, process engineering involved in that process. So I wish it was so easy, but unfortunately right now we're not quite there such that it is as easy as just printing it out and putting it on the barbecue.
Okay, so Seren, perhaps if we look into the benefits, what would you say are the main benefits of cultivated meat?
Sure. So really, really zooming out, the most important thing about cultivated meat is that what you are producing is something which genuinely looks, tastes, and cooks the same as conventional meat and is the same nutritionally and at the cellular level. But unlike conventional meat, it is made in a much, much cleaner and more efficient way. So why that's so powerful is the fact that we are actually therefore able to satisfy this growing global demand for meat, which really is growing. It's not going to decrease over the coming decades, but we can satisfy that demand with a fraction of the environmental impact. And
Can we perhaps have some data there? Could you give us an example? How do the carbon footprints of cultivated meat products compare, to products from regular livestock farms?
So because cultivated meat as an industry is as nascent as I was describing, there have not been a huge number of life cycle assessments and techno-economic assessments and ones which are able to compare across different companies and different production processes. But the best TEA and LCA that we're aware of is a study by CE Delft. And this was a study which was the first to actually be based on data from real cultivated meat companies. So actually based on their specific production processes. And the kind of high level insights that came out of that report is that if cultivated meat is made using renewable energy, it would lead to a 92% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when compared with beef, a 52% reduction when compared with pork, and a 17% when compared with chicken.
Let's just hear what John from Oxford University has to say about this. I asked him whether cultivated meat is indeed always better for the environment than a traditional livestock product.
Well, we can see theoretically why it certainly could be. But you are displacing kind of biological processes, and you do need to substitute them with something. So it's not like it just comes out of thin air. You still have some kind of nutrient input, which is probably going to come from conventional crop production still, although there's other people who have speculated it could come from very low impact kind of algal production systems. So then it comes down to that same question of, just as we would say, well, chickens can convert feed into meat more efficiently than cows, is the cultured meat process converting those nutrient inputs more efficiently than current livestock? And some of the early evidence looks like, yes, it is a lot better than kind of ruminants, cows and sheep, and even pigs. And how energy efficient that is and what the energy source is will also be a key part of this question about overall sustainability. Because right back at the beginning, I was saying as important as agricultural emissions are, the priority has still got to be decarbonizing the energy supply. So if we're talking about imagining this new process coming through that might be quite energy demanding, haven't narrowed down the figures yet, and maybe coming on scale rapidly and having a large production of this stuff, then how's that going to affect the pathway towards renewable energy? This is the kind of bigger picture question that will ultimately need to be resolved to answer these questions about if it's more sustainable or not.
Okay, so how does cultivated meat compare to conventional farming if you don't have the renewable energy to produce it and are forced to resort to fossil fuels? I put that question to Seren.
If you are using exclusively fossil fuels as the energy source for cultivated meat, it would still be significantly better than conventional beef production. That being said, if you take a kind of hybrid approach where I think the figure is around 30% renewable energy in the process versus the rest being fossil fuels, you are then more sustainable than all other types of livestock farming.
If we look at the downsides, to these alternative forms, or let's say the aspects that you are still working on to improve, what would you say are the main aspects that still have to be improved on, when it comes to the environmental perspective regarding cultivated meat? Yeah,
I think there isn't some hidden skeleton in the closet which isn't being mentioned here. Like, it really does come down to making sure that the scaled up process is as sustainable as it could be, and specifically around making sure that as much of the energy going in is renewable energy. And that is a really important point. Like, conventional meat, that there are a lot of emissions associated with it that you just cannot get around. We have made the processes for conventional animal agriculture as efficient as they're basically ever going to be. Whereas cultivated meat, we're only really beginning to start to optimize there. And it's so powerful that because we are electrifying the process, we have that option to feed in renewable energy. So it is really like a big groundbreaking deal, because there's a potential there which we could never actually realize with conventional animal agriculture. Beyond that, I think potential downsides, there's nothing that comes to mind. And because a lot of this is still in process and in motion, the scaling up of these technologies, it's kind of to be determined. And that's really also why we push so hard for government investment into the research and development, not least because we need that kind of funding to get the scale up there, but also because government investment can answer and address those kinds of questions that really matter, these kind of more forward-thinking, long-term questions. How can we ensure that these products are just as sustainable as they can possibly be and are completely nutritiously equivalent or more so than conventional meat?
Okay, so time to take a closer look at how consumers feel about these products. And it's a bit tricky, of course, because only very few people have been able to try them. So not even Seren from the Good Food Institute has. Now, according to a survey carried out in the US and UK in 2021, some 40% were highly likely to try it, while 40% would consider it and 20% rejected it. Generation Z and millennials were more open to trying it than Generation X or baby boomers, by the way. But just how easy or difficult is it for us to change our diet and do without meat? Although one could argue that cultivated meat still is real meat, something that would make it problematic for vegetarians, for starters. Time to bring in a German food sociologist on this. Germany is, after all, the land of countless sausage varieties and the butcher house of Europe, according to activists. So let's hear from Stefan Wahlen, who's a food sociologist at Giessen University.
The history has shown us that even though we might find theoretically nice solutions from a technological perspective and from a science perspective, there are also always people involved in their daily life, in their habits and in their routines. And they need to change to some extent as well, but they are rather stable and they are not going to change. So if we need to change things, it's on the one hand, of course, individual behavior, or I would rather talk about practices, what people are actually doing in their daily life. However, you also need to be supported by the infrastructures in so doing.
I was just going to say that because there is a very big and strong power, like a machinery almost, that is pushing us into certain behavior patterns, isn't it? And it's difficult to disentangle from that. It's not just that we can say, I'm going to change tomorrow, because the whole system needs to change with us, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the system. And in the end, we also see that it needs political support. I mean, we have debates about various foodstuffs that are deemed more or less favorable with regard to climate change. And it's interesting to see these debates on a more national or even international level from a sociological perspective talk about normative discourse. So there are public debates, not only from policymakers, newspapers, or podcasts contributing to that debate, that might be understanding what is normal, what is the normal thing to do. And if you think about climate issues, and there has been an increasing debate, it's already a debate going on for at least a decade, not even longer, that meat is less favorable compared to, for example, vegetables. And I think it's very interesting that still there has been little change. I think that we are living to a vast extent in our routines.
Yeah, I mean, that brings us to a very philosophical question. Can we change? And how do we do it? I mean, if food is so closely tied to culture, family, religion even, it can be super personal, right? And people get very defensive if you start, telling them what to eat or what they should be eating or should not be eating. I mean, how difficult is it to change behavior around food?
And I would rather not speak about behavior. Behavior has always the notion that there's an individual enacting behavior. I would rather take it from a more cultural perspective. And the question of what is culture, it has an individual component, but you also see that there are collective patterns. You stick to these collective patterns because they are conceived as something to be normal, because most people do not want to be different. And also with consuming or eating specific foods, we can demonstrate that we are part of specific social groups. We can change food consumption patterns, and they are changing. However, they are changing in a rather slow way, but continually. We did some analysis some years back. I analyzed some diary data And it nicely showed that over a period of more than 20 years, little has changed. The woman that was keeping this diary described their daily life and their patterns of eating, preparing food, and other daily tasks. And surprisingly, the first and the last diary, they have been rather similar.
There is one thing, as you just said, people, they want to be normal. They don't want to be different. On the other hand, if we want, changes, that is quite radical change, somebody is going to have to start being other than normal, right? And do something different. Yeah. I'm also sort of wondering to what degree the problem's also in that we always want to progress, right? We want. There has to be some kind of natural or almost linear progression that we always advance and things get better or we improve things. And I think some people, they view, even if, like 100 years ago, the food system might have been far more sustainable, they would view that as a step back if we went back to that, right? How do we reconcile those conflicting, on the one hand, you're being tugged towards the future, pulled towards the future, you want to progress. But on the other hand, maybe the things that we have to be doing is looking more to the past and how we used to do things.
Yeah. Well, the question is, what does it mean, progress? Because there might be some ways of thinking, ways of handling issues. Yeah, it's a way of how you think about the problem. To some extent, and that's what you just said, implied a little bit, that moving backwards might be considered as a progress to some extent. Because, well, what you said, in the end, we might have lived our ancestors might have lived a much more sustainable life. And I think it's very important to learn and understand how they have lived their lives because they were more sustainable. And that this looking backwards might actually be something to look forward to. And it's a question of how you frame it. And of course, it's there are particular ideologies associated with how you perceive the past, that you might glorify the past. We did some research on sustainable food with regard to authenticity. I mean, we didn't do research on authenticity, but that was something that the people came up with when we talked to consumers, that they were associating sustainable food also with nostalgic feelings. I remember one of the respondents said, back in the days when milk was still milk, because nowadays you don't have real milk. They are milk-like drinks that you can buy in the supermarket, and that you can, to some extent, glorify the past. And I don't want to fall into that trap saying, oh, we have to go back and do it exactly as my grandmother did it, but that we can learn from the past, and that I think it's vital to understand the history. History of the present is a term that shows quite nicely that the current circumstances that we're living in, they have a specific history. And if you understand the pathway, the trajectory of how this present that we're currently living in came about, we also much better understand how it might be developing into the future.
Stefan, scientists, they've said that in order to make our food system more sustainable, this will require shifts in farming and consumption. What role does the production of our food have in our enjoyment? For example, how much do we care if the end product, for instance, meat, a burger or something, if it came from a lab rather than from a cattle farm?
Technologists, the food technologists, they come up with innovative food stuff. And I think that you can see with the vegan and vegetarian alternatives, so it's not the lab meat, but rather substitute products that we currently see on the market that are gimmicking the food that we're currently eating, and they're rather successful with it. Because I think that the meat patty, it's a meat patty, and in the end, we don't know how much meat in the patty actually is. And I don't know if we really care about the amount of meat that is in it. There are a lot of varieties. In Germany, you have all these different kinds of sausages. And if you really look on the packaging, on how much meat you can find in a sausage nowadays, I'm always surprised to see how little meat actually is in a barbecuing sausage, for example. Mm-hmm. And the question is of how it is produced. And I think that producers might have much more power than the individual consumers to change what is eaten. But still, that the taste is something very important, that the way that we are enjoying our food is something which is really important. The pleasures that are associated with the ways that we might be sharing food, but also the ways that we are eating.
Yeah, talking of those products, I mean, you just hinted as well that the producers, they've probably got more clout to bring about, big change rather than the consumer. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's sort of, popping up that scientists are working on. But I mean, it all hinges on this being also accepted by the consumer, right? I mean, how do you see these kinds of products? I mean, do you see them replacing much of what we currently farm, with natural means? Are consumers open to this kind of product, or would they sort of see it as something artificial that isn't real and is not good?
I mean, I had a colleague who was doing research on insects, and he was always saying that insects are not the new sushi. He was tracing the history of how sushi made it from Asian to the Western world. It's accepted to have like novel foods, different foods. So we are willing to taste new flavors and ingredients, but it's more than
sushi's a natural product, right? I mean, that's fish. So I mean, if we take out this natural element and make it more like an experiment, a lab produced food, or something that is sort of not produced the normal way.
But the question is, what is a normal way?
Something that we can understand, something that has grown and that is natural and that is living and breathing and moving around.
But also, I mean, that's a very interesting question, because I don't think that meat is nowadays grown in a normal way.
Mm-hmm.
If you have ever been to a stable, I don't think it's normal to have thousands of pigs in like a skyscraper of 10 stories where pigs are living in. I mean, it's a question of what is normal, and I don't think only because things are tried to be produced in the laboratory, it doesn't mean that it's different. I mean, there have been different investigations over the past century on how to come up with ways of producing meat. Okay,
well, sorry, Stefan, to interrupt you there, but maybe if we take a different example then, if we perhaps take an example of vitamins, and we compare maybe, vitamin tablets to vitamins that you can draw from fruit and vegetables. I don't know whether this is a good analogy or a good comparison now, but if you were to try and increase acceptance among consumers for the tablets, which most would probably perceive as artificial or sort of something that is not really, natural, compared to selling them the natural vitamins.
Yeah, I mean, there might be acceptable, or people might be always testing new ways of eating. Even if it might be the vitamins, people believe in it, that it might be more healthy. It's in a similar way to lab-grown food. Then every now and then I see pop up some news items where people say, now we have found a methodology, but I don't see that there is already existing lab meat, and I don't know whether it will be acceptable for consumers on the broad masses. Mm. The challenge of implementing it in your daily routines, in the ways that you are preparing food. And if you manage to come up with products that are complying with these routines, then I think the likelihood of implementing it's much bigger. Mm-hmm. So it might be a meat patty made from the lab or made out of insects, whatever. But if it fits the ways of, for example, barbecuing or the ways of producing the products, the cooking in the home context, then it's more likely to be implemented.
I mean, the one word, it's a recurring theme, the routines that you mentioned. I mean, this next question, I'm sorry, Stefan, you're probably not going to like it, because it's pure conjecture. This is really science fiction now. But from time to time, there has been this idea that comes up that our food eventually, could be replaced by something like a biscuit or a tablet, sort of like astronauts' food, right? From which we could get our full dietary intake, nutrition, very, very pragmatic approach to food. Might solve a lot of problems. But I mean, you were talking about the routines and that this has to tie into our routines. Is this something that you believe could ever come about, that we would take that step?
I actually like it, the example, because it quite interestingly shows that it won't make a difference. These are examples which are coming back regularly if you're interested into food. I think it was a technologist from California saying that, well, eating is overrated, and he came up with this drink which contains all necessary vitamins, carbohydrates, protein. It was the perfect drink. You just have to drink it, and you don't have to eat anything else than this particular drink. Mm-hmm. again, that's an example from, I think, 10 or 15 years ago. And I never have seen it again because there are always these hopes of technologies that there might be some easy fixes. However, they underestimate the ways that we are eating. I think it's a nice example to demonstrate that it's not as easy as saying we have an innovative product and then the innovative product is solving all the problems that we have. Because food and eating are culturally so strong. I mean, the social component of eating is underestimated. It's a social event that we are, our daily patterns with breakfast, lunch, dinner, they are so strong that they might not be easy to change from a social perspective because we are so used to doing things in the regular way, which is good for some reason. I don't think of routines as something negative. I think they help us in various ways of coping with the complexity of our daily lives.
I mean, if we talk about the appreciation of food, how would this change? I mean, if we were just to go along that route, how would this change our relation to food and the meaning of food in our lives if it all came from the lab?
First of all, I don't believe that we might have the only lab-grown meat in the future, because of the reasons that I just mentioned. That there are people involved in eating, of course, and they might identify with specific foods. Think about local cuisines, national diets, or even regional diets, the Mediterranean diets, linking up to food that is regionally grown. The relationship that we might have to meat, it might even be turning a little bit into the opposite. That I mean, there are some initiatives that try to link the producer and the consumer even more in order to identify also with how the food has been produced. And I don't know if that might be working for the lab-grown meat as well. That people identify. Probably there are some early adopters that identify with the lab-grown meat as to be, but again, there will be public debates about it, and how they are shaped is depending on various factors. But I don't see from the past developments and all the different products that should have helped to improve health, but also sustainability, that they did not really make it. So I'm maybe a little bit more pessimistic in this regard.
So Stefan doesn't see cultivated meat taking the market by storm anytime soon. So what is Seren's timeline for the breakthrough of cultivated meat?
So I guess to answer the question when, one of the most important questions we have to ask is regulation and what regulation is going to look like. So Singapore's food regulator was the first in the world to approve the sale in December 2020. And then a year later, in December 2021, they then approved a second product from the same company. In Europe specifically, we haven't yet had an application being made to the EU. So it is likely to be at least 2 years before people in Europe are able to access cultivated meat at all, and several years before it becomes available at large enough scales to reach supermarkets. And then that's more a technical and R&D question. In both cases, the kind of ask really is towards government. So creating an enabling environment, and probably most importantly, taking seriously that this is a new sector, that it has this huge potential to displace a large amount of the greenhouse gas emissions coming from our food system. And that in order to really realize that potential, it's not just in the remit of startup companies with privately funded capital. This is a kind of an institutional and a public sector focus, and it has to be addressed in that way. So much more open access research going to space to make sure we can address some of the technical challenges needing to be addressed to enable that scale up, and then just getting it out there and having an enabling environment around the distribution and sale. So the regulation point I mentioned, also things about kind of where it can be sold and what it can be called, things around labeling laws. We are seeing some governments being incredibly supportive in this way, especially Israel and Singapore, who have been leading globally in supporting the development. But Europe really does just have to join them in that race and make cultivated meat an option for everyone. Otherwise, we will essentially be left behind, I think.
And finally, let's bring back John just one last time to hear how he views the chances of cultivated meat becoming the new normal one day.
So I think we have seen, and we will continue to see, changes in our food and in our farming. So, half a century ago, there just was not oilseed rape production in the UK, and now it's one of the main crops that many farmers will grow in the rotation. So we do get big changes happening quite soon. But in terms of when cultured meat is available kind of at scale for the average consumer, I think ever since the kind of first cultured burger was eaten in 2012, we've been told repeatedly this is just a few years away, kind of mass production, and we're not there yet, obviously. So I think some of the timelines have been a bit ambitious when they've been stated there. But ultimately, I think this is a societal question that we haven't really engaged with properly yet. And I feel that the argument has become a bit polarized, and that's presented things in a way that are actually just unachievable, because we've switched off the average consumer by maybe being a bit heavy-handed in some of this messaging. But this conversation about, okay, we know the food system is damaging and we know we need to change it, but how do we actually change it, and what do we want that to look like? Do we want to keep some areas of grazing cows because we simply like them? Or no, actually, do we want a more radical redesign and spare up land for other carbon or biodiversity purposes? And I don't think we're going to get the answer or get to real change until we have this more nuanced conversation.
Okay, so time for my main takeaways. First off, cultivated meat could lead to a 92% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when compared with beef, a 52% reduction when compared to pork, and a 17% reduction when compared with chicken. I think those really are remarkable figures that will stick with me. That's why I've just repeated them for you as well. Of course, these figures, they only apply if renewable energy is used. So it once again comes down to expanding renewables ASAP across the board. Cultivated meat would help us free up a lot of land, and the production process doesn't involve the killing of any animals, which personally I find great. However, it still requires animal cells to be sourced, so we would still be keeping livestock to a certain degree. And as critics point out, it may extend the lifespan of companies involved with conventional factory farming, and who may see this rather new technology as a means of diversifying their portfolio, so to speak, a bit like oil companies who invest in renewables while holding on to their more lucrative core business. So yeah, of course, that is debatable. Do you want these businesses involved, or do you need them to actually, really scale this up in the first place? But I think one of the key aspects overall is consumer acceptance. And even if all the boxes on sustainability and animal welfare, etc., were ticked, replacing meat with cultivated meat will only work if it pretty much looks the same, tastes the same, or better, and as Stefan highlighted, fits pretty much seamlessly with our routines and customs. And these obviously they differ very strongly by region and also culture. So I thought it was very interesting how Stefan described how our habits regarding food change only very, very slowly, micro changes. That's what he said. I think of the example that he quoted, the lady who kept a diary for 20 years, and the first entries and the last were the same when it came to, what she was eating. So all considered, it sounds to me like cultivated meat is probably not the silver bullet to solving our meat problem globally, at least not in the immediate future. And the problem is that we don't really have the time to wait any longer than 20 years to decarbonize the farming sector, because we will miss our climate goals if we do. So at the end of the day, I think, we could save ourselves a lot of trouble if we could just get off the meat drip that we're on and focus more on a plant-based diet. But pretty much all the scientists that I've talked to, about this topic, they say that this simply isn't realistic, and that globally meat consumption is going to grow significantly by 2050. So given this addiction that we seem to have to meat, it seems like the only chance that we've got is to push for more products that mimic meat really well. So starting with plant-based patties and sausages, for instance, which are already widely available. And at the same time, maybe as a backup, it does make sense to develop affordable cultivated meat products for the mass market for the future, just in case. You never know. We might need them to meet our targets in the end. And who's to say that in time they might become the new normal? Stefan says micro changes, but maybe, a lot of micro changes will get us there eventually. That's my 2 cents for now. Please do let us know what you think. You can send an email to onthegreenfence@dw.com and we'll get back to you without fail. In the meantime, why not write a short and sweet review on Apple Podcasts? We'd certainly appreciate that. Time for me now to wrap up. Many thanks to my sound engineer, Michael Springer, and my producer and colleague, Natalie Muller. And a big thank you to you for listening to On the Green Fence. My name is Neil King. Take it easy and take care.